In this module, you will learn how to design a policy analysis on your defined public policy problem. The purpose of a policy analysis is to guide decision-making on addressing public problems through the formulation and implementation of policy solutions. To do this, analysts compare proposed policy alternatives, or courses of action, by selected evaluative criteria to determine the extent to which the competing alternatives achieve their desired policy goal. When creating your research design, think about it as 4 broad parts: the statement defining the problem, the criteria used to evaluate the selected policy alternatives, and evidence used to compare projected outcomes. Each week, we will dive deeper into each of these parts, but I want you to begin thinking about them now in the formation of your preliminary research design. A helpful tool to help design your research approach is what I like to call the policy analysis pyramid. In the problem statement, you identified your policy goal and objectives. These may be viewed as the inverse of your problem definition and act as a target for policy formation. The evaluative criteria and associated measures help you determine the merit and feasibility of selected policy alternatives to achieve the policy goal and objectives. Let's break this down a bit. The policy goal is typically far-reaching towards an end outcome or state of being. For example, a safe workplace, improved water quality, or a booming economy. Outcomes often take years, if not decades, to achieve. To keep on track, policy objectives are set, often with timelines and deliverables. The objectives act as tangible outputs of implemented policy that measure progress towards a longer-term, more intangible goal. Evaluation criteria are essential to measuring achievement of any objectives. The range of options is vast, but these 4 represent broad, commonly applied categories of criteria that have bearing on policy design's ability to achieve intended outcomes. You will need to refine your criteria to ensure they are relevant and specific to your policy analysis. But here's an overview of these 4. We'll begin with technical feasibility. The principal criteria is effectiveness and adequacy. Effectiveness focuses on whether or not the proposed policy will achieve its intended effect. Often the best way to predict effectiveness is through assessment of how similar policies have worked elsewhere. Adequacy measures how far toward a solution we can proceed with the resources we have available. Even an effective program may fall short of its objectives or only solve part of a much larger problem. Moving on to economic efficiency, the major reason why economics has become or has played such a large role in policy analysis is that decision makers and policy analysts alike often prefer hard analysis as it is easier to communicate quantitative terms. It comes as no surprise that an economic evaluative criteria would focus on tangible, monetized, direct costs and benefit. And we will go over each one of these types of analyses in subsequent modules. The next 2 are political viability and administrative operability. A policy has very little chance of being implemented if it doesn't pass the political tests. Assessing political viability involves evaluating policy alternatives, acceptability, appropriateness, responsiveness, legality, and equity. The acceptability refers to both actors in a policy or political process or the clients or recipients of the public goods or services. Really, you need to measure the acceptability amongst the most salient or important stakeholders. Appropriateness is related to acceptability in that it addresses issues of values, but it at its core is an ethical question about whether the policy objectives should be pursued at all. If policy objectives raise human rights or concerns or environmental justice issues, you may have to think long and hard about whether you are willing to conduct the analysis. Responsiveness. This involves target group's perception of whether policy will meet its needs. Will it be responsive to the needs of citizens and provide what they need or want? Legality. Can it be considered political, as laws are often made and changed through political action? I ask you all to start here, investigating existing laws, as they will directly affect the design of your alternatives. Equity. Policy changes seldom affect all parties equally and are difficult to completely prevent externalities. But you need to know if your proposed policy will have a disproportionate effect on a specific population. Lastly, administrative operability. Do you have the available administrative capabilities and delivery infrastructure to carry out the objectives and achieve goals? You can look at this as, do you have the authority to implement? This is a critical criterion. Does the targeted implementation group or agency have clear authority to make necessary changes and determine priorities necessary for implementing the policy? Is there an institutional commitment? This includes office and field staff, as well as top administrative officials. Are they committed to implementation? This is necessary in order to assess whether or not it's an unrealistic policy, and to focus attention on organization changes that are needed in order to implement the preferred alternative. Capability. These are the essential human technical skills and the financial resources that are needed to carry out or implement the policy. And lastly, organizational support. Does the agency have sufficient equipment, the physical facilities, and other support services? It's needed to assess the current and future availability of these resources when thinking about how your policy will be carried out long term. Lastly, measures. Measures are the operational variables that judge how close each policy alternative come to satisfying the stated criteria. In other words, if we view evaluative criteria as the concern surrounding the problem, the measures allow us to see how well each alternative addresses those concerns. For example, the cost to implement policy is a common concern, and thus economic efficiency is a commonly used evaluative criteria. The measures would be the specific implementation costs. In the teenage pregnancy example from before, the measures may include the cost to educate and distribute birth control when evaluating the cost efficiency of that policy alternative. Lastly, I'm going to briefly identify the analytic models used in policy analysis and how they correspond to evaluative criteria. Again, there are 4 broad categories of analytic models: economic, decision-making and impacts, political, institutional, and ethical analyses. We will go over each one of these 4 types in individual modules. However, here's a sneak peek at the various types and their associated criteria to get you started.